May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your eyes, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Good morning. The reading from Matthew this morning is one of my favorite passages for several reasons. First, it's not really a parable, but a descriptive narrative that clearly tells us how we are to be judged at the end of time. Secondly, there's the inclusiveness of the judgment. Notice that it says all nations will be gathered before him, not just Jews, Gentiles, or followers of Christ, but all the nations. A universal judgment where Jesus, the King, will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Another reason I'm drawn to this reading is that it is the only place in any of the Gospels where Jesus, in verse 34, refers to himself as king. Then the king will say to those at his right hand. Seems appropriate for Christ the King Sunday. Jesus refers to himself as the king who will make the final judgment. But even more compelling is that later in the reading, we have Jesus aligning himself with the least of these. This is a king like no other, one of compassion who places himself among those who are in need, among those who are at their weakest. I also love that the basis of the king's judgment is not on how many hours we spend in church, the extent of our prayer life, or the amount of our charitable contributions. Not that these aren't important, they are, but here the judgment is based on how we treat others during our lifetime, what we do when we see someone in need, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the prisoner. We are saved by how we treat others. We are justified by our works and actions that are driven by a deep understanding of the just treatment of the least of these. It also implies the importance of the actions we take against the injustice being experienced by those considered to be the least of these, like immigrants, refugees, and the oppressed. For us to correct, to bring justice to those who are suffering, that is what we are to do. This reading for me ties together justice and salvation. There isn't a mention here of grace or of faith, and please don't think I'm dismissing them. It's just that the focus here is how we treat our fellow human beings, how we show compassion, love, caring, and understanding to people in need. In the reading, those who did care for others by showing compassion and understanding were judged worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Those who did not were met with another fate. But I think this goes a little further than just actions and goes to the motivation behind them. When Jesus identified those who were righteous because they did care for the least of these, they seemed surprised by it and responded with, "But when did we do these things?" It's as if they saw and cared for others in need, for the least of these. It was a natural response for them to do so, like a second nature. Doing so not because it would get them into heaven, but doing so because it is how God meant for us to care for each other, to be compassionate and to love each other in the here and now. Love thy neighbor as thyself, especially when someone is in need. On the other hand, we have the accursed, those who did nothing for the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, or the prisoner. They also seemed surprised at their verdict, indicating they basically didn't remember having seen those in need. And most likely they didn't. They saw right past those in need, being far more concerned with their own welfare and needs. And that is what Jesus, the King, is judging against, a blindness to those who are in need, to the injustice that exists in the world. When we turn from pursuing justice for every human being, we're turning from Christ. That's a powerful and scary image to keep in mind, but it is one we need to remember. This reading from Matthew is the only place in any of the Gospels that describes the Last Judgment. None of the other Gospels speak to it. The judgment is all based on our treatment of others, whether we see the face of Jesus in the least of these that we pass every day, and whether we reach out to help, to love, or just look right past them. I'm sure we can identify ourselves in each of these groups at times in our lives, both the righteous and the accursed. Sometimes we may find ourselves among the least of these. There are times when each of us may have been in need, when we were hungry or thirsty or sick or a stranger. And at those times, we probably experienced what it felt like to be seen and loved by others. And we experienced what it felt like when others saw right past us. We experienced what it was like to be met by a righteous sheep as well as by an accursed goat. Most of us can relate to being on both sides. This love thy neighbor thing goes both ways. And Jesus, as King, places himself among the least of these as well as with the righteous. This past week, there were several stories in the media that grabbed my attention because they epitomize that sometimes the role of righteous and the least of these are reversed, showing that we are all among the righteous and among those in need. One of those stories from CNN took place on Thanksgiving Day in 2007 in Arizona, a few miles from the Mexican border. An undocumented immigrant, Manny, was attempting once again to make his way deeper into Arizona to find work and a new life. He was very conscious of avoiding the Border Patrol. But suddenly, he found himself walking towards a 9-year-old boy, Chris, who was searching for help, perhaps from the Border Patrol, to save his mom, who was trapped in her car. The car had gone off the side of the road and down a steep hill. The boy was able to get out to look for help, but his mom was unconscious, yet still breathing. The boy asked for help, and Manny knew he had a decision to make. Keep walking or try to help Chris and his mom. He did not walk away. Manny thought of his own children. They were around the same age as Chris. He knew he'd want someone to do this for them. Manny and Chris realized they had a language barrier, but found ways to communicate beyond that. Political arguments about immigration did not matter. There was only a boy who needed protection, a woman who needed rescuing, and a man who appeared to be their only hope. Manny went down to the car to see what he might be able to do, but it was too precarious to try anything. So they went back up to the road and built a fire to keep warm and to try to attract the Border Patrol. In the morning, 2 men in a pickup truck with a working cell phone came by, stopped, and called 911. Manny could have taken off at this point, but he didn't. His purpose changed that night. An ambulance, rescuers, and firefighters showed up in response to the 911 call. Unfortunately, Chris's mom didn't make it, and Manny was sent back to Mexico. But that wasn't the end of this story. And you can read the article to learn more. You just need to Google, quote, "A migrant had crossed the border," end quote, or let me know and I'll send you the link. Manny, an undocumented immigrant, is an example of an individual being the righteous and being among the least of these, expressing a very simple and natural love for his neighbors, even though across the border. It is how we can make a difference in the world. We can, on an individual basis, be the righteous that Christ the King describes. When we do it for the least of these, we do it for him. And perhaps we can be a part of creating the social structure based on the dignity of every human being, as Christ the King taught us. Amen.